Hello and welcome to this Inventor tutorial. This is a basic tutorial for those who have no prior experience with Inventor. Today I am going to be showing you how to make this assembly file, starting with the basic parts and then creating the final assembly with the moving functions. To start off, this screen opens whenever you open up Inventor. Up here at the top we have a bar that says New Open Projects. This is pretty self-explanatory. We also have them in front of us in this main screen. We are going to start off with a new part. Each one of these links is a single part, and then the assembly is in the end comprised of all of them put together. So we're going to start off by creating the first part. So go over and click Part. By the way, I have changed the colors around, so you will most likely, if you haven't used the program, it will be kind of a gray gradient around back. Nothing is wrong with your program. Also, the icon color has changed. I did this just to make it easier to see on the video and they show up more easily. So, we have a basic viewport window. This allows us to see our object in three-dimensional space. We have down in this corner a Y arrow, it's green, and an X, an arrow that's red. Those are the Y and the X axis, respectively. We also have this blue dot. Up in the top corner, we have a square that when you hover over it, other icons appear around it. This is our orbit cube. Actually, it's not a square. And we can use it to orbit around what will become a three-dimensional model in front of us. So we can see it from all angles. For now, you can see that as we move it, we move around the pivot ball. And also that the axis down here rotate as well. And that blue dot, turns out, it's the z-axis. So we have three-dimensional space in front of us. Now, we can click and drag around with this cube, but if we want an exact view, we can use the front, top, right, bottom. We can use those faces. By hovering over those faces on the cube and waiting for them to highlight, we can then click on them and we'll bring the camera up to, right now, a top. We can use the arrows to go to the next one. So we have a front, we have a right, but if we want to go back to the same basic view, if we want a home view, we go over and we click the home icon. And that will bring us back to our basic orientation shown down here with top, front, and right. Then we want to start our model. We're going to start not with 3D but with 2D. In order to create our three-dimensional model, we first have to create the basic two dimensions, so our length and our width, and then we will extrude it to give it height. So we're going to start with a 2D sketch. We're going to go over to the 2D sketch button up in the corner. And we have a drop-down menu for Start 2D Sketch, but we also have an icon. We're going to click the icon just to jump right in with the tool. As you can see, a shape appears in front of us on the screen. The shape is actually three planes. We have the XY, the YZ, and the XZ planes. Those are created using the axes down in the corner. And we're only going to start our sketch on one of the planes. I'm going to pick the horizontal plane just because I want to give it length and width and then extrude up to give it height. So I click on the plane and we now have a different view in front of us. And we need to start by creating our basic rectangular shape. Now we could use the line and we could create 4 lines and give them all dimensions. Or, more easily, we can just use the rectangle tool. We're going to click again on the icon and not the drop-down menu, just to jump right in with the tool. And what we have selected is called a 2-point rectangle. This means that we can click anywhere in our white viewport space to create the first point. And now we can finish editing the dimensions of the rectangle with a second point. It is a 2-point rectangle. Our first point is anchored in space. Our second point determines the length this way and the width for us this way. And as you can see, there are two dimensions that show up and change depending on how we move the mouse around. Those two dimensions are the basic dimensions of the rectangle, and we already know what we want those dimensions to be. We want the length of the rectangle to be 1.5 inches, and we want the width to be 1/4 of an inch. So we don't have to finish the rectangle right now. We can actually type in those dimensions and it will finish the rectangle for us. So I want my width to be 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is 0.25. So I'm going to type in 0.25. Now I started with the width because the width dimension was highlighted in blue. That will be the first one to edit. Now we want to jump over to the second one, so I'm just going to hit Tab on the keyboard to bring me over. Now I'm editing the second one, and it has locked the dimension of the first. So I'm going to type in 1.5 for 1.5 inches and hit Enter to finish it off. Now our rectangle here is kind of off to the side. We're going to hold down the center mouse button, the scroll wheel, and now we can, using that, the click and drag system, we can pan around the object. Using the cube, we can orbit. This changes the rotation of the camera around the object. Panning simply changes whether the object is in view or not, and it only moves it along a single plane. As you can see, the axes stay the same and the cube stays the same. So I'm going to pan, and I can, using the scroll wheel to scroll, I can zoom in and out. So I'm going to pan and zoom until I have it centered to what I think works. Now, as you can see, our rectangle icon is still highlighted, and I still have the yellow first point dot following my cursor around. If I were to click again, I would start to create another rectangle. Now, I don't want to do this. I only want to create one rectangle. So I am going to right-click with the mouse, and now a new thing appears. It's a pie chart with a little drop-down menu. And we are just going to click Cancel Escape X. And that exits out of the tool, and now we have our rectangle in front of us with the proper dimensions set. So this is all we need for our first sketch. So I'm going to hit Finish Sketch. This brings us out of the 2D phase and into the 3D phase. We can now create a 3D model in front of us. So we're going to use the Extrude button. As I said before, we would create two basic dimensions and then extrude up. The Extrude button, when we click on it, you can see it brings the basic shape that we have and gives it its third dimension, its height, and it creates a box. Now this box is really, really tall. We don't want it to be 1 inch tall, we want it to be 1/8 of an inch tall. So we are going to edit this by clicking where it says 1 inch, waiting for it to turn blue. Of course you need to highlight it. And I'm just going to type in 1 divided by 8. Now Inventor will do some simple math for you. So you can do addition, subtraction, division, and sometimes multiplication in this window. You don't always have to do decimal points. So I can type in 1/8 or I can type in 0.125. I'm just going to go with 1/8. So then I can hit Enter and it will finish off the shape. And I can use the Home button to center the shape and center the axes. So now we have our basic rectangle. But you might notice that we're missing the 2 holes for each side where we can finally lock around the axes to create the rotary motion. So we need to create a new sketch that will give us 2 holes. We're going to create a hole, and then we're going to extrude them down, cutting out the material and creating our 2 holes all the way through. So in order to create a new sketch on top, because we want to use this top face and then extrude down, we hover over until we have the entire top face selected, and we right click, we get the pie chart drop down, and we're going to hit New Sketch. Now that brings us back up, and as you can see, we have our shape showing up as well because it's still visible in the window. But it's also sideways, and it's kind of hard to center it. like this. I want the long ways to be the long ways of the window. So going over to our cube, there's two kind of curved arrows at the top. I can go and click one to rotate it 90 degrees to the given direction. And now it's much easier and it centers perfectly. So I want to use the outside borders of the rectangle when I create the two holes. I want to use them to reference 4 dimensions. The dimensions I want would be 1/8 of an inch from the top for both holes to center them along the line, the center, and I want 1/8 of an inch from each edge just so it's uniform, and then I want all the holes to be 1/8 inch in diameter. Now, in order to use these lines as reference, it's easiest if we go up and we hit project geometry, if we hit the little icon above it. Now this will take the instance where the object that we now select overlaps with the sketch plane that we are using. So this will give us exactly what we see in front of us. So in order to get this rectangle, we're going to hover over until we have the entire face selected, not just one of the edges. I'm going to click, and now you can see as I move my mouse away, it's yellow around the outside. Those yellow lines we can now use to reference 4 dimensions. So I'm going to right click and cancel to exit out of the tool. And now I'm going to use the circle tool to create the 2 circles. As you can see, when I move my circle center point, because it starts with the center point and then you pick the outer dimension. When I move the center point to about halfway in between this line and this line, a dotted line appears and it kind of anchors for an instant the center point to that dotted line. That dotted line is halfway along this edge. You can see that if I move along the edge, a green dot also appears and anchors. That's the midpoint. It helps us center exactly 1/8 of an inch from both sides because the center is, this line is 1/4 of an inch and then 1/8 of an inch would be half. So we can wait and we can just use this to already set some of the dimensions that we would need to later set. It makes it a little easier for us and less time consuming. So I click once to create the center point about where I want the center of the circle to be in relation to this line. And now you can see that as I move my mouse around, I am changing the dimension of the circle. Now this dimension that's highlighted in blue right now, that's the diameter. It automatically starts with the diameter dimension of the circle as opposed to the radius. So this is fine for us. We want our dimension of diameter to be 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to type in 1 divided by 8 instead of moving my mouse around to the correct location. It makes it much easier. I'm going to hit enter to set that. And as you can see, we now have a circle where the center point is 1/8 of an inch from this line, and where the diameter is 1/8 of an inch. That's 2 things that are correct. But we also want the center point to be 1/8 of an inch from this line. So I'm going to cancel escape to exit out of that tool. Now to add that last dimension and lock it in place, I'm going to go up and use the dimension tool. Now for the dimension tool, we can select either one line and then get the dimension off that, or we can select multiple points and lines and then get the dimensions off those. So I'm going to select the center point of the circle because that's the first point that I want to use. Then I'm going to select the line because that's the second that I want to use. And now you can move the mouse around and place the dimension wherever you want. I'm going to place it outside the rectangle shape so I don't have to deal with it being inside. I'm going to click once and that sets it, and then I can click it again. Now I can edit the dimension exactly. As you can see, it's 0.1517, all that stuff. Now we don't want it to be 0.152, we want it to be 0.125. So I can just type in 0.125 right now, and if I hit enter, it will change it. As you can see, it has moved the circle closer to the edge. The reason it did not move the edge closer to the circle is because the edge is already defined in world space, the world space being the basic XYZ coordinates. It's already defined in that location. It's locked to its points in that location because it is part of the bigger actual rectangle extrusion. So it is not going to move. We are only going to move the center of the circle. Now I can move over to the other side to create the second hole. And again, I get this center dimension line, so I'm going to use that. And now as I scroll up, you can see another dotted line appears, which will allow me to confine it to the top of this circle there, if you look again. And that's nice because it anchors it easily to around 1/8 of an inch. Right now it's saying it's 0.125 inches, so I can click anyway, and I don't have to actually set the dimension by typing it in. So now I can use the dimension tool to give it that last dimension, and again I can set that, and then 1 divided by 8, enter to set, finally, cancel. And now we have our two holes, and they're in the right location, and they're the right dimension. So we're good with our sketch. We're going to hit Finish Sketch to move back into 3D. And again, we're going to use the Extrude button. Now, it did not extrude any shape like it did previously with the original box, because we have multiple valid extrusions. You can tell by when we hover over them, different portions turn and highlight. We only want to extrude the two holes, so we're going to highlight the holes and click once, and I can click another hole to extrude both at the same time to the correct dimension. So that makes it easier. You can do as many of these as you want. And now we have two pegs that stick out of our object. We don't want pegs, we want holes that go down in and cut out the object. So we're going to go to the plane with the arrow, that's our direction, and we're going to hit direction 2, just to reverse the direction that it comes out as. And now you can see it kind of turns red. Instead of being a solid shape, we can use the drag arrow for an inexact dimension, and you can see that it's red and it's kind of transparent. That shows us that it's cutting out the shape instead of creating new matter in that spot. And as you can see, it also has kind of given us a hole. So this is perfect. We're going to hit the check mark or press enter to finish it off. And now we have our first link. This will be the shorter of the two types of links, because in the end we only really need 2 links. We don't need to create 4 parts. We're going to see that we have to create the 2 parts with the different dimensions, and then we can use as many as we want. So we have just created the shorter of the links. We now have to create the longer of the links. But before we do that, I'm going to save this part. To save, we go up to the eye at the top, go down to the scroller from save, and hit save. And now you're going to want to create a new folder, because you want all the parts for your assembly and your final assembly model to be in a spot you can easily find and you can easily recognize. So I am going to create a new folder. I'm going to title this Widget 4 for me, and I'm going to open it up, and I can save it inside that. And this is my first part, so part 1, just 0.4 for Widget 4, and then just hit save, basic save. So now we need to create our second link. So in order to do that, we're going to go up to the eye, and we're going to go to New, and New Create File. I'm going to pick the standard, just double click on that, and we're right back to our blank screen. So I'm going to go through this quickly. All the commands and controls are the same as with the previous link, it's just we are changing a single dimension. So start new sketch, pick the bottom, going to create a rectangle. This rectangle, this side is still going to be 1/4, but the longer end is now going to be changed to 2 inches. Give it a little bit of a change up. Then we're going to create one hole. Mention that. Second hole. Mention that. Going to go center point to the edge. And then finish sketch. And we're going to extrude this back up to 125. And now that we have our part, we can hit save. And we can go back to our widget 4. And I already have another part in there. I'm just going to get rid of it. If we want to do this, hit yes to replace it. You guys will not have to do that. That was only for me. And now I can go on to create the full assembly file. So in order to do that, we are going to create a new file. This time, instead of clicking new part, we're going to go with new assembly. And now an assembly file, you don't create parts within it unless you are changing up certain aspects. You are going to use parts that you have previously made, such as for me part 1 and part 2, and you can place them in and then move them around and create relationships between those so that they move together or stay fixed together. And this is where you will create a full mock-up of say a car engine or a robot arm, anything big, not a single part but multiple parts. So to start off, we're going to go to place and again hit the icon and not the drop down, and it opens up to our widget 4 folder. So I'm going to select my first part. I'm going to hit open. And you can see the part is coming up. We're actually in a front view right now. It sometimes will lock onto the front view for the first part. That's fine. So we click once to set it. Now you can see that we have another one ghosting around. So we can actually put multiple parts in of the same part at the same time instead of needing to do one and then go back and hit place and open that part again. So we want 2 of these, because we're going to have 2 sides of the rectangle be 1.5 inches, and then the other 2 sides be the 2-inch part that we just made. So I'm going to click a second time to place that, and you can see we still have the ghost. So I'm just going to do right-click and cancel to get rid of that. Now I have those 2 parts. You can see that when I hover over them, instead of the face of each part being selected individually, it is highlighting the entire part. So I can hover over this part and I can click and hold, and now I can drag it around. You won't be selecting the actual faces and the insides of holes like you would be if you were in a normal part file like this or this. You will be selecting the entire part. So now I need to place the other 2 parts. So place one, just to organize it for myself. And now we go up. You can see I'm just going to pull these out so that they are in kind of basic layout for how we're going to attach them. As you can see, this part and this part are in the wrong orientation. That's fine though. That will be sorted out when we finally add constraints and allow them to move. They will be locked to a certain position. We do not have to rotate the parts now. You can see there's a free rotate button up on the side. We can click on something, and then we can rotate the part so that we can get an idea of how it should line up compared to the others, but it won't necessarily speed things up, and it might in the end actually mess things up because the orientation will be weird and it can lock onto other parts. So we're going to ignore that, and we're going to go straight into constraint. which is what we'll be using. We're not going to do joint tool because that's more complicated and we really don't need all of the stuff that it offers at the moment. So we're going to go into constraint, and now I can select two, we'll call them features for now. You can select two faces, you can select two edges, you can select a face and an edge, you can select center line on a circle, you can select the top of a circle, and it will constrain, it will add a constraint between those two. So for now, I want the bottom of this piece to be constrained so that it is always in contact with the top of this piece. One will be on top of the other. And that will mean that they won't go flying apart from each other, seeing as how we don't actually have any pegs to hold them together. So I'm going to drop down underneath so that I can click the bottom face, and that's now the first face that we're going to constrain. And then I'm going to select the other face, and you can see that when I highlight over, I can select edges still. We want to make sure that we are selecting the face and not the edge. And that's all good, so we're going to hit OK. And now you can see that I can move this piece around and I can move this piece around. As I move this bottom piece around, the top piece moves, and as I move the top piece around, the bottom piece does not move. That is because the order that we constrained it, one is constrained to the other, and while the other will stay within the constraint required of it, it will not necessarily be affected by the movement of the first. So we selected this part first. It is the one constrained to this part. So this part is directly controlling everything, and the constraint is actually to this part. It's not between them. So it is more complex. We're going to ignore that for now, but just so you can get an idea, you can see no matter where I move them, that line there, the bottom of this piece is always constrained to the top of that piece. So now we want to make sure that when we move one of these pieces, it's actually rotating around that center circle instead of hovering around in air. So we're going to add another constraint for that center joint, and we have to hover over the center so that this line appears down the center. This will constrain the center line of the holes as opposed to the circle with the green dot, which would only constrain the top of the hole. So we're going to constrain center line, and hit OK again. And now you can see that it will rotate. And of course, because the constraint, the way it's set up, if we move the other one, the first one does not move. But once we go into moving this one so that we can actually get a rotation, it does move around the second one. What we need in the end is for one of these pieces to stay fixed in position so that when we move the entire contraption, that piece doesn't move as well. If it stays fixed, then all the other pieces should move the way they're supposed to. If it moves as well, you can get all sorts of random shapes, and then linkages will start to lose any sort of power that they once had. So we are going to select this bottom bar because we want it to be fixed. So we're going to select it, and we're going to right-click on it. And you can see we got the drop-down menu. We're going to go down to Grounded. Now, when we go to hover over this part, you can see a little thumbtack-like shape appears right next to the cursor. And there's also a little grounded symbol for those of you who know electronics. So this means that we cannot move this part. I am clicking and dragging this part around and nothing is happening. We can still drag this other part around, and now you can see that it rotates around the center and it's fixed and it doesn't move away from this part. So this is the final movement that we want to get out of this part here. So this is great. Now all we have to do is constrain these other two parts so that they match up. So this one will be on the same level as this, and this one will be on the same level as this. Now we could constrain this face on the longer part to this face on the shorter part, but just an easier thing to do instead of having to think of it that way, we can just constrain this so that it is parallel to the top of that face. At the moment, you can see under solution, there's mate and there's flush. Mate will make the faces contact each other. Flush will make them parallel to each other by the normals. So it will make sure that they're always facing the same direction as opposed to always in contact. So we're going to click flush instead. Now you can see that it's nice and it's on the same level. Go and hit apply, which allows us to continue on instead of having to reopen the command. I'm going to try to select the center line. Give me a moment there. Okay, so okay, that was a mistake. So you cannot, in fact, select the center line when it is in flush. You can only select it when it's in mate. So let's try this again. I click back into mate, and there we go. It's set up. So I selected that first one, came over, select the second one, hit apply. That now works. We're going to select, we're actually going to move this part out of the way so that we can select the top face here without moving the camera. Going to select the top face there and the top face there, and we're going to make them flush. Hit OK. We're going to move this one back, constrain, make sure it's in mate. It should automatically revert back. Going to go and constrain those, hit apply, and we're going to constrain those two, and hit apply. And now, if we go up to the top and orient it, you can see that you have 4-bar linkage. So there is no contact physics between these. Parts will glitch into each other if the dimensions are set up so that they can. But everything will now work around its rotational physics, axes, and other constraints that you have set up. So congratulations, you have just created a 4-bar linkage assembly, and you can go up and save that the way you would with the others. And you can notice that when you go into saving an assembly file, the part files have disappeared. This is because it's saving as the type of an assembly, and for some reason it won't show you the other parts. That's fine, they are still there. So I'm just going to do assembly 1.4, save that. Yes, I will replace this. And there we go. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you continue to love Inventor.